Welcome to today's National Weekly EMS Zoom news briefing. I'm Sandy Close, your moderator for today and EMS director. Our briefing today focuses on the war on transgender people. So far this year, more bills targeting transgender rights have been introduced and become law than at any time in U.S. history. And I have to say, they're some of the most extreme legislation I have ever read. Some 29 bills have already become law in 14 states, compared to 20 bills passed into law in 12 states last year, according to an analysis of ACLU data by the Washington Post. In a number of states, healthcare providers face felony charges for providing gender-affirming care, and that's only one example. Our speakers today will update us on this war from the front lines in 3 states, Florida, Texas, and North Carolina. Our 4th speaker shares stories of families fleeing for safe havens from states where anti-trans laws have gone into effect or are about to do so. Our speakers, to whom we are very grateful, include Nadine Smith, Executive Director of Equality Florida, Texas State Representative Jean Wu, Democrat from serving the Houston Greater Region, Sailor Jones, Associate Director of Common Cause North Carolina, and Susan Mosh, founder of the Trans Youth Equality Foundation. Speakers, please speak slowly for our interpreters in Spanish, Mandarin, and Korean. And our colleagues in the media, please enter your questions in the chat. We will take questions after each speaker, as you know, with a final round of questions at the end. And we'll be sending a video of today's briefing and expanded bios with contact information for each speaker to all our participants later today. So let's begin. And we begin with Nadine Smith of Equality Florida. Thank you, Nadine.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this. The conversation that we're having, I will tell you about the bills that we have seen passed in Florida. But I think the bigger story and the most important thing to understand is not only the what, but the why. So in Florida, last session, our sessions last 60 days, a bill was brought forward that, or actually 2 sessions ago, a bill was brought forward that would ban trans athletes from playing sports. Even though in the history of Florida, in more than a decade, there hadn't been more than 10 trans athletes, and there were existing guidelines in place to provide fairness. What became clear was somewhere, some think tank had come up with the idea that Americans were not very familiar with trans people, even less familiar with trans youth, and therefore, for purposes of political scapegoating, they were an easy target. And the idea that that was true became the proof that it was true because the architects of this coordinated multi-state attack on trans people were actually quite willing to share in the New York Times. As they put it, after marriage stopped being a wedge issue and a strong consensus of Americans support marriage equality for same-sex couples as well as hetero couples, they needed a new target. They needed something else that they could whip people into a frenzy about. And they did a lot of focus group testing, and what they came back with was trans issues make people uncomfortable, and trans youth issues made them even more uncomfortable. So suddenly, out of nowhere, you see these bills popping up in Florida, in legislatures all across the country. In Florida, we have the distinction of being home to both Donald Trump and the Florida governor, Ron DeSantis, both of whom are candidates for president, one announced, one unannounced, but has made it clear that he's running by all of his actions. And so we have a governor trying to outflank Trump to the right, who has sort of pulled every single one of the firebrand MAGA-based issues to the forefront. So in addition to a 6-week ban on abortion, we've seen bills that target drag shows and pride festivals by issuing vague threats of fines and criminal charges to intimidate businesses that have drag performances or local governments that host pride events. We've seen an expansion of the infamous Don't Say Gay, Don't Say Trans bill, that when they passed it, they swore that this was about keeping inappropriate material away from kindergartners, first, second, and third graders. But it was written so broadly that books were just being taken wholesale off of libraries. And we mean any book that includes a transgender character, an LGBT character of any sort, books that deal with race and racism. The Life and Times of Rosa Parks was taken down. A book about the history, in some cases, of people famous in the town where the school is located. And in addition to what the letter of the law is, the rhetoric surrounding it was so overheated and so dehumanizing that school districts have, out of a fear of complying with language that is really vague, in some places gone to the extreme. In some cases have told, for example, a gay teacher that they can't have their partner's picture on the where one keeps the picture of your family. We also, in the final weeks, saw the return of the anti-trans bathroom bill. And in many ways, as a Black Southerner, when we start talking about access to restrooms and public spaces, I know that it's not truly about bathrooms. I know that it's about limiting the ability of trans people to be in public space. And so you have this bathroom bill that perpetuates discrimination and the exclusion of trans Floridians. We had trans adults and teens saying we avoid drinking beverages when we go out in public because we do not want to be accosted just for trying to use a restroom. So this bathroom bill applies to restrooms and changing rooms in schools, prisons, detention centers, all government buildings, and it deputizes pretty much anyone to challenge your presence in a restroom. And the enforcement of it is quite vague. So if I were to encounter anyone here on the way to a restroom, I have the right under this law to challenge whether or not you're able to be there. And if you don't leave, you can face criminal charges. And having the aligning gender marker on your driver's license is not sufficient. Technically you could be compelled to prove your chromosomal biology in order to avoid being in violation of that law. There's also a license to discriminate in healthcare, which is a bill that creates a broad license for healthcare providers and insurance companies simply to refuse service based on their religious belief, their moral beliefs, their beliefs, period. And then, in addition to a takeover of higher education where they've defunded diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, and many schools are fearful that any programming towards the LGBTQ community or racial minorities is also at risk under this. But I will tell you, there's research that has come out showing somewhere between 1 in 4 and 1 in 8 college students or prospective college students have taken Florida off their list because of this dismantling of academic freedom. And then finally, and perhaps the most chilling overreach of government power, is a dangerous ban on life-saving medical care for trans youth. This is a law that overrules a parent's right to seek medical care for their trans child. It criminalizes healthcare providers who provide that care consistent with the guidance of major medical organizations across the country. And it also restricts access to that care for adults, even those who've been receiving that care successfully for decades. So when I say that I can tell you what's happening, but the why of what is happening is the critical piece. Why are these attacks happening? Why is there such a dedication of resources, that where we've seen the largest number of explicitly anti-LGBTQ bills passed, where we're seeing book bans, where we are seeing just an all-out war on freedom. And the thing that I think is important to understand is that is really the issue. We are fighting over the definition of freedom, and we are fighting over the definition of democracy. And everybody has a stake in that. You don't have to know a trans person to understand that when schools are being told you must take books off of the library, where you cannot teach about racial justice, that you cannot tell the truth about American history. In Florida, teachers are offered $3,000 to take a training by the state where they're told, don't say that George Washington or Thomas Jefferson were slavers. You're not supposed to mention that. And if you do, you are supposed to put it into a context that says that they actually opposed slavery and knew that the only way to end it was by building America, and that the values of America would eventually cause slavery to fade away. So the other reason that this impacts everybody who is watching what's unfolding in our states is that it, the textbooks, the people that produce textbooks saw the majority of the textbooks they sent to Florida rejected, saying that it was riddled with critical race theory or social emotional learning. And when we finally got a hold of the criteria they used, one book was rejected, a math book was rejected because it included an excerpt noting that Katherine Johnson was the first Black woman to ever lead a department in NASA. Why are you talking about this? Why are you talking about race? Why are you including that? But now you have textbook publishers censoring themselves to get through the censorship process in Florida. So a publisher changed their book, instead of saying that Rosa Parks was challenging the racial segregation of Jim Crow and refused to give up her seat. She did what she thought was right. It now reads, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. She did what she thought was right. No context, no understanding. And we've seen this before. We saw it in this country. We saw it when the daughters of the Confederacy insisted on replacing American history with Confederate propaganda. And in many ways, we are seeing the same thing, this whitewashing of American history, the erasure of American history. And it emerges as much, I will say, all of these attacks are very much emerging from a demographic reality, which is the graying of America and the browning of America colliding. And the graying of America because of a whole host of inequities means that that older demographic is overwhelmingly white. And the emerging demographic, there is no single racial group that is in the majority. And so what had been primarily a city phenomenon of racial diversity is now nationwide. I grew up in the Panhandle in places that were considered quite literally, Southport was a place that as a Black kid, I was told you can't go to Southport. When our bus rolled through Southport, we were told to slide down in our chairs so our faces wouldn't be visible in the window because they'd open fire. And now if you go to Southport, you will see interracial couples, you'll see bodegas, you have to go to Southport because that's where the airport is. So when we talk about this demographic shift, it's not through the lens of demographics or destiny, but through the lens of the existential panic that it has created, where people who, 10 years ago, if you told them they would eventually be voting for somebody who mocked disabled reporters and was credibly accused and now convicted of sexual violence and all of these things, they would have thought it was utterly absurd. And now we find ourselves in a place where it has been normalized because it is rooted in a fear that America is changing, privilege is slipping away from a group that isn't accustomed to acknowledging that it has privilege. So I'm going to pause there because I certainly want to leave a few more moments for questions. But the headline is, it is an attack on the trans community. It is an attack on the LGBT community. It is an effort to whitewash American history so that we don't speak honestly about race. It is an attempt to not make America great again, but to remove the progress of decades.
Thank you very much. Nadine, I let you speak longer because you have to leave early for another appointment. There are questions in the chat, which I would really value having you respond to if you have a few minutes, one of which is, I think, related, very important question of what do you think the objective is? And then we're going to go to our next speaker just because of time. What do you think the objective?
Yeah. Well, the objective is a kind of apartheid state. When you go about banning immigration bans, whipping up a level of xenophobia. Right now in Florida, if you go, you will see footage of places where no work is happening because of anti-immigration laws that are really quite punitive. When my hometown was decimated by Hurricane Michael, it was immigrant labor that rebuilt that community. And a lot of people who out of one corner of their mouth are feeding this anti-immigrant, racist rhetoric and hysteria were depending on the very same people they are vilifying right now and demonizing to get their homes back. And so this cognitive dissonance in American life has everything to do with unresolved political confrontation with racism. We are not moving in a linear way forward. We are whipsawing back and forth, Reconstruction 1, Reconstruction 2, and we're in the midst of yet another place where the failure to deal honestly with the role that race plays in American society will continue to bedevil us. And we find ourselves again in a place where this manufactured thing called whiteness that has been offered to wave after wave of immigrants at different times when it's politically expedient is now being offered and in order to divide within the Hispanic community. And so
right,
our inability to speak about this honestly is creating a place where they want to erase any conversation that, and any institutions, after they watch the multiracial protests in the aftermath of George Floyd, they began to ask themselves, how do we reverse engineer this
Right.
multiracial future that we see marching? How do we reverse engineer where we saw businesses speak candidly about race?
So,
And what they said was, we're going to go into the schools and we're going to eliminate any curriculum that we think leads towards racial justice. We're going to go to the corporations and we're going to tell them they can't do diversity, equity, and inclusion training. They, just like they do around voting, where they say to themselves, what will minimize young people voting? What will minimize Black people voting? And then they reverse engineer the legislation that will cause that to happen.
okay,
That's what we're dealing with.
okay, we're out of time. I'm going to go to our next speaker, but if you have 1 or 2 minutes to look at the chat and respond on the chat, that would be fabulous. And thank you very, very much. Our next speaker is Representative Jean Wu, who is joining us while the session in the Texas legislature is still going full tilt. Thank you for taking time out and welcome to this briefing on the war on transgender people. Please tell us how you see this playing out in Texas and the bills you're fighting to oppose in the Texas legislature.
Hi, thanks for having me. So my name is Jean Wu. I'm the state rep out of Southwest Houston. This is my 6th session, so it's like over a decade in the Texas House for me. So we're actually here today. I'm geared up to fight our anti-trans bill on the floor today. In fact, this is the 3rd time we've dealt with this. We've managed to send this bill back twice back to the committee. And finding procedural errors in it and forcing it to go back. And they're bringing it out for a 3rd time. And normally when a bill gets killed that many times, gets sent back that many times, a lot of times the, leadership just says, you know what, no more, we're done, because it's taking up too much time, too much resources, too much attention. Time and attention that we can be using to do other things, anything else, anything that's important to the state. And I think it says a lot to the fact that they're devoting this much effort to going after a small minority population that really has done nothing to any of them and not done anything to those communities, but they're going after them. And unfortunately, this is actually pretty standard MO. So in years past, look, we've had back a long time, we had plenty of anti-LGBT bills, period, because they were just the convenient target of the time. And after a while, after LGBT people became more accepted after the Windsor case, after Obergefell, some of that went away, and we had to find new targets. Then we found the Central American refugees coming over, and they're the invaders, and they're powerless, so we're going to pass bills against them. And then it was Muslim Americans. They have relatively little political power, so we're going to pass bills against them. And this session, we've been dealing with anti-Chinese bills that directly target the Chinese community, because the Asian community as a whole, we don't have a lot of political power, and we're not like super active. And so that was a really convenient thing to do. Fortunately, we were able to sort of like rally the troops and rally the community to defend against it. But they still have other targets, and unfortunately, the trans community, even and even within the LGBTQ community, the support for trans rights, support for trans people are not as strong as they probably should be. And so the basic MO for the legislature, of any legislature, and especially the Texas legislature, is we the people in charge look for communities, look for groups that are convenient targets that the people in general don't like necessarily understand, may not have the most sympathy for. There's sort of a, there's always sort of an ick factor that they use, and we legislate against them. We beat the crap out of them in the law, and say we did it. We fought back against those people. And the thing is that those people, they just change. The names of those people just change over time, and it's always some group that they're going to find that is on the periphery of our society, people who the general public lacks understanding of, and all these things. And what we try to tell our communities, especially like in Asian immigrant communities that may not be the most open and sympathetic towards LGBTQ people in the first place, that look, the hate is the same. If you don't help defend against anti-trans people, anti-trans legislation, the same people that went after the trans community will come after you next, right? And we've already seen this. It already happened. The exact same people who are most up in arms about going after the trans community are the same ones who are the most up in arms going after the Chinese community. And we had this fight with the community back when we did like the Muslim bans and all this other stuff. And the Asian community, like, sometimes I would say, well, I'm not Muslim, not my problem. And I said, like, it's only a matter of time until they get to you, right? And one day they're going to get to you. And it hasn't even been the full decade, and they already have. They're coming after the Asian community. And so one of the things that I think is really important for all of us as advocates is to say, the people who want to oppress minority communities, the people who want to use people who have little power as the foil, as the enemy, as the monster that they want to slay, the hate is all the same. The only thing that changes are the names of the victims. And so either we fight together, either we all stand up and we fight together and say, no, leave people the hell alone, or you're going to be next. And that's just it. So I don't know that Democrats can stop the anti-trans bill in Texas. We're going to do our damnedest. We've sent it back twice. Maybe we can send it back a third time. But I think the Republicans are going to keep trying, because this is apparently a hot button issue for them. And we've had people who have told us, like, look, I don't really care about this stuff. I don't really want to do this, but we campaigned on it in the primary. And if we don't do it, then they're going to primary me. And, basically, it's just a really fancy way of saying I'm a coward. And I refuse to do what's right, but I'm happy to do what's politically expedient. So what is going to actually stop this? The real thing that will stop this in this entire line of attacks, not only against trans community or the LGBTQ community, or against the African community, Hispanic community, after Muslim community and Asian community and everyone else, is for good people, average Americans, average Texans, to stand up and say, no more, enough, right? And to say, like, look, we don't like it when you guys do these issues. We like it when you work on education. We like it when you work on healthcare. We like it when you pay teachers. We like it when you make sure we have enough parks, and you make sure we have enough hospitals. Those are the things that matter to us. When you focus on these type of issues, we will punish you and we will vote against you, right? And it's already starting to happen. I think there's already been a backlash at a national level against Republicans for focusing so tightly onto like banning CRT, anti-LGBT issues, going after abortion and contraception, and all these other things. In Texas, we have bigger questions. In Texas, we have like, have you fixed the damn grid yet? No, right? Every single time there's a weather event, we're like, are we going to lose power today? And have we taken care of public education? No, right? Teachers, they got a small raise, but probably still not enough. Have we fixed a whole bunch of healthcare issues? No, we haven't. Still have not expanded Medicaid. So I think it's important for people, for our communities to learn about all these issues and say, like, look, I am not trans and I may not have a lot of trans friends, but I understand that they have a right to live their lives the way they see fit. They have a right to consult their own doctors. They have a right to consult their own families, and they have a right to do what they feel is necessary to keep themselves alive and keep themselves happy. Just as I have a right to do what I see fit and control my own body and control my own healthcare. I don't think that, is a hard thing to ask. So that's it. I'm happy to take questions.
One quick question, and there are some great questions, Representative Wu, on the chat, but one quick question. Do you fear that there will be a backlash against you for your stance on trans rights?
No, absolutely not. Not to pat myself on the back or anything, but I have never lost any sleep doing what I felt was right. And if I lose my seat because I did what was right, good. All right.
And what do
I'm happy to take that hit.
And what is your most effective argument to get people who are just paying attention to getting through the day and surviving to say, this is the line in the sand? We can't send parents to prison for providing gender-affirming care to their kids.
I think my message to the general public, people who maybe are not necessarily advocates, people who are not necessarily in the know, my answer is simple: leave people the hell alone. That's it. I think that's a sentiment that every American should understand. Just leave me alone. It's none of your damn business. It is none of your business, right? It's no one's business who I sleep with, who I love. It's none of your business how I modify my body. It's none of your business whether I want to take contraceptives or don't want to take contraceptives. It's none of anyone's business, and especially not the government's. And the full irony is the people who are out there calling themselves libertarians, calling themselves the Freedom Caucus and liberty lovers, are the ones who are pushing this. The people who want small government are pushing this, right? This is the opposite of a small government.
Great, thank you. If you could look at the questions in the chat and stay with us for our last two speakers, that would be great. But thank you so much for your sharing your situation and your perspective on this. Now we go to Sailor Jones, who is with Common Cause North Carolina. Sailor, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Sandy, and thanks to Representative Wu, especially his tie. I know visibility is so important, even the colors of the trans flag today in Texas. So grateful to him and to Nadine for fighting the good fight in very tough environments, Florida and Texas right now. So grateful to them. And a very similar environment here in North Carolina, Sandy, like Florida and Texas. North Carolinians are no strangers to the highest of profile attacks on LGBT people over the past decade. You may recall, and reporters may recall, North Carolina was the last state to write anti-LGBT discrimination into our state's founding document back in 2012 with a ban on marriage equality. That was called Amendment 1. And a few years later, conservative lawmakers, many of whom are still in office due to gerrymandering, responded to local non-discrimination ordinances by passing what was known then as House Bill 2, what is the now infamous so-called bathroom bill here in North Carolina that denied access to public restrooms based on gender identity. And that kicked off state and national debates over the rights of trans people that continue today, where in many cases, fear and prejudice won out over basic common sense. And fortunately, House Bill 2 also kicked off a state and national boycott for travelers, similar to the travel warning that Nadine and Equality Florida set off around their anti-trans bills. It also set off a boycott by business and even celebrities to the state of North Carolina that helped ultimately blunt the types of bills we're seeing today and the policies around them. And so it may come as no surprise then that at a time where nearly 500 anti-trans bills have already been introduced in 49 of 50 states, one of those states now includes North Carolina. And those bills include proposals that would erode student confidentiality with school personnel. They seek to restrict trans people from receiving gender-affirming care and prevent trans youth who already face challenges in terms of discrimination and mental health challenges from participating in affirming sports that align with their gender identity. So advocates for LGBTQ rights have been tracking upwards of a dozen anti-trans proposals in North Carolina's General Assembly in 2023 across multiple categories, many of which Nadine and Representative Wu mentioned in education, healthcare, and sports. And several of these bills have already advanced through at least one chamber. Bills called the so-called Parents' Bill of Rights, which would require healthcare providers to get written parental consent before even treating trans young people, including for gender-affirming questions, putting trans youth at risk of violence. Bills called the so-called Fairness in Women's Sports Act, which would bar trans youth from the sports that they identify with. And things like surgical and gender bars for trans minors, which would limit life-saving care for young people in North Carolina. We've even seen a bill, in addition to drag bans and don't say gay bills, that fortunately stalled in the North Carolina House that would have given healthcare providers a license to discriminate against trans youth. Any healthcare service that, quote unquote, violates their conscience. So like so many states, legislators have made it their mission to limit kids' sports participation based on their gender identity, as well as ban drag performances and other types of LGBT curriculum in schools. But I want to mention, maybe unlike some other states, these bills are not the only thing fueling anti-LGBT rhetoric as they are in North Carolina. As he prepares for his expected campaign for governor next year, North Carolina's current Lieutenant Governor, Mark Robinson, continues to amp up high-profile rhetoric against LGBT people that has become a key part of his campaign and his political brand, similar to Governor Ron DeSantis and former President Donald Trump. Mark Robinson said recently on the campaign trail that God formed him to fight LGBT issues, and he added that a church that flies the rainbow flag is a direct spit in the face of God Almighty, and that the transgender so-called movement is of the Antichrist. So Robinson is currently making the rounds at Black churches in the region where I grew up, northeastern North Carolina, the state's Black Belt, in the hopes of using his fear campaign to sow hatred towards the LGBT community rather, and build support for hate mongering ahead of the high profile 2024 presidential elections I know we're all looking towards, and that many of these bills are designed to sow hate and division between political parties ahead of those high profile elections. So we're seeing a lot of the same things that Representative Wu is seeing in Texas, Nadine is seeing in Florida, right here in the Tar Heel State, Sandy.
What is your sense, Sailor, of how this is impacting members of the trans community in North Carolina and deepening divisions? Or are you seeing a big effort to rally around the cause of transgender youth?
Well, one need only listen, Sandy, to the voices of the families, many of which I suspect Representative Wu may be hearing from today, guardians and young trans people who were allowed to speak in very limited public comment on these bills happening here in North Carolina. One such parent was an Orange County mother. Her name was Katie Jennifer, whose daughter Maddie is transgender. And she said she made a promise to her child that mommy and daddy aren't going to let anything bad happen to you, and that these types of laws make it harder and harder for her to keep that promise. And this kind of encapsulates what we're seeing nationwide. We know that the vast majority of transgender and non-binary youth say debates around these anti-trans issues are negatively impacting their mental health. We know nearly half of trans youth have experienced cyberbullying, and many of the same report that they don't feel safe going to the doctor. So add to that the rise of the type of rhetoric from gubernatorial candidates like Mark Robinson ahead of the 2024 election cycle. And I suspect we'll see more negative impacts to transgender North Carolinians of all ages in the months to come. And as a native North Carolinian and as a transgender person myself, who has lived through and fought through both the anti-LGBT Amendment 1 and the anti-trans House Bill 2, I will admit that this is the first fight that we've considered, me and my wife, leaving my home state. Just last month, a reporter sheepishly asked for permission to publish the city where I live in as part of a report he was doing about our work in voting rights. And that was him asking permission out of fear that the article, which mentions my gender identity in passing, might put my family at risk. So that said, as I said during the fight against Amendment 1 and House Bill 2, this is my state, Sandy. This is my home. This is my North Carolina, and I'm not going anywhere.
And there are questions, Sailor, if you would review the chat questions, that would be terrific. One of which was on the effectiveness of the travel ban, the call for people to avoid traveling to these states that are supporting such toxic bills against transgender. Do you see a gathering of forces around trans rights, or are you afraid that people will just say there are too few of them, there are other bigger issues at stake?
Well, Sandy, we discussed this and know many people feel like we are losing ground on all sorts of issues, from abortion rights to immigrant rights to even civil rights, at a time where the Voting Rights Act is attempting to be rolled back at the US Supreme Court. But I would argue that in many ways, just like during the Amendment 1 days or the House Bill 2 days, where we lost those laws, but gained visibility in those campaigns, that we are actually losing forward. And so in addition to the visibility of trans people being so necessary where they feel safe having these conversations, as you mentioned, it will be very important, as Representative Wu mentioned, for unlikely allies to be front and center with this. I mean, in the case of Amendment 1 and House Bill 2, both of those discriminatory laws were blunted by faith communities, business communities, medical professionals coming to the fore and fighting with their trans neighbors, their trans siblings against these things. That political and even in some cases financial pressure will be so important in the fights ahead. But most importantly, as Representative Wu said, it's vital the public understand that trans people's rights to live freely, abortion care, people's right to vote, they're all inextricably linked. And while they're coming for trans people now, like the famous quote goes, and they came for people with African descent, they came for people with Hispanic heritages, they came for people with wounds. If you don't do anything about it, then they're going to come for you, and there will be no one left to speak for you. So now is the time to speak up and fight before there will be no one left to do it for us.
Thank you. Please stay with Representative Wu as our last speaker. Susan Mash gives us an overview of the numbers of people who are actually now fleeing from these hot zones, doing what you're hoping not to do, to leave your home state, and you're determined not to leave your home state. But Susan, welcome, and could you share some of the stories you, as a funder of grants for people in these extreme situations, are hearing as people turn to you for help?
Sure, thank you for having me. Our organization began in 2007, and there are a number of programs that we have for transgender youth all over the country. We're a national organization. But recently we've decided that we would announce that we were offering microgrants to any families that were fleeing red states. And we put the word out there, and we have heard from hundreds of people. So of course we're overwhelmed by requests, and the stories are heartbreaking. The staff has spoken quite often about how difficult the days are, hearing the stories. It's very different hearing about it on the news and knowing what's right and wrong, and then hearing the individual stories from the mouth of the families that are fleeing. Our families come from all over red states. A number of them, I would say the most that we're hearing from is Florida and Texas. But I just want people to know that it is, as you can imagine, it's not hard to imagine, but families are so scared, and the rhetoric and the discrimination and the emboldening of hate towards them, towards their children, even in school, it's increased so much that there's a fear and there's an urgency that a lot of families feel. So what it really looks like are hundreds of people packing up cars, leaving their houses, either selling them quickly and in a sense dumping them, dumping their accounts, leaving apartments and in fear that they won't be able to then have a landlord reference where they're trying to go to. And leaving their families, their friends, they're all their relatives. Some of them have lived in these states for generations, leaving everything that they know and doing it, almost in the, dark of night kind of situations, but, fleeing really essentially in U-Hauls and trucks and cars and whatever they can take with them. Many stories of families selling all of their furniture just to have enough money to put down on an apartment where they land. And children that are afraid and feeling a lot of expression of feeling guilty and sad and worried about their parents, that they're responsible somehow for the stress that their families are going through, that their siblings are going through. So we're trying to do the most that we can, and what we can do is somewhat limited. These are micro grants that might, really make a difference to the family. The maximum grants that we're able to give are $3,000. So it's very sad, and there are people from all incomes. But we heard from a grandmother who's daughter and her husband and the children packed up and left in a hurry and feeling threatened. And she is 1 year from retirement, so she felt she couldn't go, so she's being left by her family, and they were heartbroken and worried to leave her. And these are the kinds of stories that really that we're hearing. We've heard from a single mother who has 3 children and no savings and no money, and literally selling her furniture and everything, leaving her entire family, her own mother who's elderly and not doing well, her siblings, all of their lifelong friends, and getting into a car and moving to places they don't even often know people. Sometimes people will head to a safe state where they might know somebody, but often, this family, for instance, the mother with 3 children, is heading to Minnesota. It's considered a safe state. It's announced it's a safe state. She doesn't know anybody in Minnesota. She doesn't know where to go in Minnesota. She has to go to the most low income areas, low housing cost area. Might not even be able to go if it wasn't for the grant that we're offering. So that kind of thing.
Could I ask you, is there a single source of fear that stands out? Do people tell you what it is they're most afraid of?
Yes. Well, yeah. The escalation of discrimination, whether it's in the schools and even in their neighborhoods, and hate speak kind of stuff. But also, of course, it's the medical. It's often discussed that it's the medical, because for some, it's the standard of care for children that are transgender to be able to access care by their pediatricians and their endocrinologists. And these politicians, what other medical situation do you have to fear that politicians are making medical decisions for you and your children? And it's outrageous. And the politicians have not done their homework and tried to be helpful at all, besides being harmful. And so they are, discussions about forcing children to detransition, giving them a month to get off of their hormones, not understanding how complex hormonal systems are, not understanding the dangers involved, not understanding the hopelessness and the depression that the children will feel, the parents will be in fear of, that maybe their children will go back to feeling hopeless and suicidal. And then they're, this thing about politicians deciding that children can't access care and doctors can be prosecuted. We have a lot of parents saying that they've tried to discuss this with their children's doctors, but they can't even get appointments for their next care, or to check or do their blood work and to move forward, are being canceled right and left. We hear this hundreds of times. They can't even access their doctors, and they won't go on and continue to treat them. And so, they're very much afraid, but it's also dangerous, and I wish that people would attend to this issue more, that a child will be suddenly just taken off of their treatment, and and clinics being closed. And it wasn't long ago, just a few months ago, that we had a situation in this country where almost every single state in this country, including the red states in the Deep South, had a children's hospital that had a clinic, a transgender clinic for children, youth under 18. And you could, if a child or parent called from anywhere in the country, it might be an hour drive from them, it might be a 2-hour drive from them, but there was a gender clinic in every state in this country. And now they're being closed down. And private practices are not seeing these children and not following through with their treatments. And so there's a great fear about that. And like I said, it's partially a fear that the children will, that the parents feel that the children will give up hope. And also the terrible, situation that you go through medically when you're asked to reverse care.
Right. There's so many questions that this is opening up in the chat that we can't get to. If you, our speakers, wouldn't mind, and thank you so much for all of you who are addressing, the speakers who are answering the questions, please take these questions and perhaps we can send you the ones we haven't gotten to and you'd be willing to share your thoughts on this. We have time for one last question for each of our speakers. And the question really is looking at how dramatic the shift in public opinion was around same-sex marriage, which moved so rapidly from negative views to positive views. What are we seeing in what is arguably not covered enough as a cultural war front line, this war on trans youth? Are we seeing a rising awareness of, which I think Nadine referred to, of the isolation and the real exposure and vulnerability of trans people to these attacks? Are we reaching a public audience enough with stories of the kind we've just heard Nadine, I'm sorry, Susan and Saylor talk about personally? Is there a beginnings of, are you seeing the beginnings of rising public awareness of this? Or are we seeing a deepening in the sense of righteousness on the part of people attacking trans youth? And if, as one of our questioners said, if too many people finally succumb and really, for the sake of their children or families, leave rather than stand and fight, could we wind up with truly a divided country with trans rights as perhaps the most unexpected but deeply felt wedge issue? How do you read the public, where the public is at? And it's a question for all of us because we are in the business of informing, engaging, and advocating for the issues we care deeply about in our communities. Let's start with Representative Wu. How would you gauge the public, where the public is at, and what do media need to do to raise the visibility of this?
I think the public is still unsure, especially specifically on trans issues. I think the public is probably comfortable with LGBT, in a sense of they are like marriage equality, things like that. I think that's all water under the bridge, and people are like, okay, it is what it is. I think in terms of trans healthcare, you know, the right, and this is somebody asked the question is who's they. It's the Republicans. I mean, I know this is a nonpartisan event, but I mean, there's very clearly one side doing this, and Republicans have carefully navigated and narrated a story, the background of, well, we're just protecting the kids. We're protecting the kids, right? Even though the kids have come to us and testified, we don't want your protection, and your protection makes us want to kill ourselves. And we have talked to those families who say, we don't want your protection because your protection makes our kids makes our kids hate themselves and think about taking their own lives. We've talked to the doctors who say, like, those kids don't need your protections because we're looking after them. But it doesn't matter because, you know, all they talk about is, well, boys are chopping off their penises. I'm like, no one's doing that. No one's doing that at age 12 or 13 or whatever it is. No one's doing that. But it doesn't matter because just like January 6th, right? Saying like, well, you know, Trump won the election and there's nothing you can argue. Say, well, no, we have the statistics and the data from all 50 states that he very clearly did not, but they're going to go, well, no, there's fraud everywhere. I'm like, what fraud? And so I think what will make the biggest difference is for the media, for advocates, for people who are allies, people need to know that trans people are just normal people. That they're just, you probably know someone who is trans, you just don't realize it, right? Just as people changed their mind about LGBT, about marriage equality, because they finally said, oh, actually, there's a lot of gay and lesbian people who that are in their everyday lives, and all of a sudden, when people come on, they say, "Hey, you know, I'm gay, right?" And they go, "Oh, really?" I was like, can I ask you to make sure that, you know, you support me and my husband getting married, and whatever else?" And people go, "Oh, okay, well, that's different then." Right? Like Dick Cheney, all of a sudden, you know, when his daughter came out, it's like all of a sudden it's like, oh, Dick Cheney is very progressive in terms of LGBT issues because his daughter is LGBT, right? I know it sounds stupid, but that's what it really is. It's like people, like a lot, especially conservatives, don't care unless it's somebody they care about.
Yeah.
And I think what we need to do is find more people, advocate for people by saying, hey, you know that so-and-so, you know that who's your friend, who's your coworker, who's in your family is actually trans, right? So
thank you. 1 minute, Sailor, your last thoughts on this question.
Well, Sandy, you hit the nail on the head when you talked about isolation. Obviously, that may be the intent of these laws, to isolate trans people and make them separate from society. It's also the impact of these laws as trans people face these proposals and rules. They are separate and apart from the families, the doctors, the schools, the infrastructure that they so desperately need. And I think it behooves the media now to make the connection, as they have, as Representative Wu did, for marriage equality. It's no surprise that when the Dobbs decision came down from the U.S. Supreme Court, stripping many Americans of abortion access almost immediately, that LGBT activists sounded the alarm that we, in the form of marriage rights and other privacy protections, could be next. The LGBT community knows well and has long understood that our liberation is inextricably tied to your liberation. It's time the media and the public understand the reverse of that, the vice versa of that, and understand that their liberation is tied to trans rights too.
Okay, thank you. Susan, I hate to say this, but you have 30 seconds.
Well, I want to make sure that everybody knows that the ACLU and the Lambda Legal has announced the 9 states that they're going to take first to court. Montana, Arizona, Kentucky, Tennessee, Florida, Indiana. I think I have that right, in Oklahoma. So I think that's almost accurate. And so there is some hope. Courts take a while. Meanwhile, there are a lot of families suffering. And I just want to say, as a mother of two transgender children, that I'm just as much in love with my children as you are in love with your children. And I don't want to rely on politicians to make medical decisions for my children. I want to rely on our doctor and our team and our pediatricians.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And thanks to our media and interpreters for giving us an extra 6 minutes. This is such a vitally important topic, and for bringing it to the surface and giving us a chance to learn more so we can better cover it. Thank you. And this conference is now closed.